predecessor would always use that as an excuse to not talk about the value of the dollar. But here I find the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's in charge of the dollar, in charge of the money, in charge of what the money supply is going to be, but we don't deal with the value of the dollar. But you do admit you have a responsibility for prices. But you know, the hard money economists who have been around for a while, they have always argued that this would be the case. Those who want to continue to inflate will never talk about the money.
Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Renacki, I'm looking at the report that you handed out this morning, and I was wondering if you could take your copy and turn to page 26.
Okay.
There's a table on page 26 which consists of your balance sheet, and one of the entries on the balance sheet is under assets, central bank liquidity swaps, which shows an increase from the end of 2007 from $24 billion to $553 billion in change at the end of 2008. What's that?
Those are swaps that were done with foreign central banks. Many foreign banks are short dollars and into our markets looking for dollars and drive up interest rates and create volatility in our markets. What we have done is, with a number of major central banks, like the European Central Bank, for example, we swap our currency, dollars, for their currency, euros. They take the dollars, lend it out to the banks in their jurisdiction. That helps bring down interest rates in the global market for dollars. And meanwhile, we're not lending to those banks, we're lending to the central bank. The central bank is responsible for repaying us.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion, and you don't know who got the money?
The loan went to the loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.
Well, let's start with which central banks got the money.
There are 14 of them, which are listed in our. I'm sure they're listed in here somewhere.
All right. So, who actually made that decision to hand out $1 trillion that way? $500 billion. Who made that decision?
The Federal Open Market Committee.
Okay. And was it done at one time or in a series of meetings?
A series of meetings.
And under what legal authority?
We have a long-standing legal authority to do swaps with other central banks. It's not an emergency authority of any kind.
Anything specific about it?
Do you know my counsel says Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act.
All right, we actually looked at one of the arrangements, and one of the arrangements is $9 billion for New Zealand. That works out to $3,000 for every single person who lives in New Zealand. Seriously, wouldn't it be better to extend that kind of credit to Americans rather than New Zealanders?
It's not costing Americans anything. We're getting interest back and it comes back. It's not at the cost of any American credit. We are extending credit to Americans.
Well, wouldn't it necessarily affect the credit markets if you extend $500 billion in credit to anybody?
We are lending to all U.S. financial institutions in exactly the same way.
Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.
So who owns the Federal Reserve Bank Corporation? The Rothschilds and the Bank of England and the London banking houses ultimately control the Federal Reserve banks through their stock holdings of bank stock and their subsidiary firms in New York. The two principal Rothschild representatives in New York, J.P. Morgan and Company and Kuhn Loeb and Company, were the firms which set up the Jekyll Island Conference at which the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, who directed the subsequent successful campaign to have the plan enacted into law by Congress, and who purchased the controlling amounts of stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914. These firms had their principal officers appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council in 1914. In 1914, a few families, blood or business related, owning controlling stock in existing banks, such as in New York City, caused those banks to purchase controlling shares in the Federal Reserve regional banks. In the Housing Banking Committee staff report of August 1976 and the current stockholders list of the 12 regional directors of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks show the same family control.
The Federal Reserve ever tried to manipulate the U.S. stock market?
No, sir. Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of, but you're the attorney, right?
That's right.
So you might not even know, right?
I would expect to know if there were something like that being done. I'm not aware of that at all.
And if you did know, you'd be bound by attorney-client privilege, and you wouldn't be able to tell us, right?
Sir, if there were something the Federal Reserve were doing outside its legal authority, I would have an obligation to say something about that.
All right, so we agree that any participation by the Federal Reserve in the stock market or the futures market is outside the Federal Reserve's legal authority, right?
The Federal Reserve has some authority to regulate various aspects of markets and participate in markets in certain ways. So I think your question is too categorical, but...
I think not, actually. Why don't you answer it?
I don't know what would... I don't know... Your question is so overbroad, I don't know where to begin to answer that.
I don't think it's that overbroad. I'd like you to tell me whether it's within the Federal Reserve's legal authority to try to manipulate the stock market or the futures market.
So I don't believe the Federal Reserve tries to manipulate the stock market.
Tries? Come on.
No, so...
Do they?
The Federal Reserve's obligation and what it does in monetary policy is try to influence interest rates, and in that way to maximize employment and to stabilize prices.
Now,
sure
if
how
in
that
fact the
fits into
Federal
your
Reserve
question.
were trying to do that or doing it, isn't that something that we'd want to know?
And the extent that the Federal Reserve influences interest rates, it does make announcements of that decision immediately.
That's not what I said. I said
is. You
manipulate
said,
the
"Wouldn't
stock
you wanna
market or the
know?"
futures market. Wouldn't we want to know? Yes or no?
Could you define what you mean by...
I think you know what I mean, Mr. Alvarez. Now, wouldn't it be very helpful to have a GAO audit on that subject? Wouldn't it?
I don't know what it is that you're seeking to audit, sir.
What
It
I
would
just
be helpful
said.
if you could
Let's go on
outline
to
your
something else.
specific
Does the
question.
Federal Reserve actually possess all the gold that's listed on their balance sheet? Do they actually possess it?
Yes.
Has that been audited by the GAO?
I believe that's within the GAO's authority to audit. It certainly is something that our independent accountant is able to verify and does.
So if I go ahead and ask for a GAO audit, you won't oppose it, right?
To auditing the presence of the gold on the facility, I don't see any reason to object to that.
Good. Now, there's been all sorts of claims of insider trading and front-running by the people who execute the trades for the Federal Reserve in the market. By the way, who is that? Who actually executes the trades for the Federal Reserve in the markets?
I haven't heard of any allegations of front-running.
Well, that's
or
funny
improper
because you're the
trading at
general
all.
counsel, so if anybody would know about it, you'd think you would know about it.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is responsible for affecting the transactions implementing monetary policy.
Okay, so then answer the question.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's your answer?
You wanted to know who implements...
You have people sitting in
conducts the
screens at the Federal Reserve Bank
transactions?
actually executing those trades. You don't delegate that to anyone else?
No, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, of course, it's a process where there's several steps. Federal Reserve Bank of New York executes transactions through primary dealers.
Okay. Who are the primary dealers?
So the list of primary dealers is on our website.
Do you know any of them? Can you name a single one?
Sure. JPMC.
Go ahead, what?
JP Morgan Chase.
Okay. Do you mind if we have a GAO audit to see whether there's been front-running or insider trading by them? Do you mind? Is that okay with you?
I'm not sure I have any decision-making authority.
Well, you're the
but
general counsel. I want to know if you're going to try to stop it.
GAO audits government agencies, you want an audit of a private entity. I think that's something that Congress would have to change the authority of the GAO to allow.
All right, now let's say, you're right, that's what we're doing right here, by the way. Let's say that the Federal Reserve gave $1 billion to a very promising fledgling institution called the Dick Cheney Savings and Loan, whose only asset is an unnumbered Swiss bank account. Don't you think it would be a good idea to have the GAO have authority to look into that?
So under the GAO authority as written, a loan by the Federal Reserve to a specific entity, say a particular bank, as you've pointed out, would be subject to GAO audit. We don't oppose that.
All right, now the Federal Reserve has given $1 trillion out. $1 trillion in the past 12 months. That's how much the increase in its assets and liabilities in the balance sheet has been. Who got the money? This, by the way, is a question sent to me by Beatrice Delgado. She just wants to know who got the money. Will you tell me?
So the most of the increase in our balance sheet has been the purchase of U.S. government securities and the purchase of agency guaranteed securities in the open market from market participants broadly.
And what about the rest of it?
Time has expired.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I really think we need answers to these questions, and the only way to get answers to these questions is to have the GAO audit the Federal Reserve. Thank you very much.
I don't know about you, but something doesn't ring true there. And it certainly shouldn't. Because Hawks Cafe has discovered evidence that these things were absolutely happening at the very highest levels of Wall Street, gaming the street like a casino in Vegas. Or perhaps Atlantic City.
I want to bring your attention to the XLF, the Financial Sector Exchange Traded Fund, because this is what we used as a lesson to warn everybody about distribution, if you recall, back in June when we were at all-time historical highs, and we were wondering why were we seeing so much indication of hard motivated selling in this fund when the Dow was at 14,000 and the S&P was coming up to catch it for all-time highs or 6-year highs or 7-year highs? Why were we seeing all this selling? And we know now why we were, because the guys who run Wall Street were distributing at a top. Now, here we are down almost 1,000 points lower on the Dow after the trap door has been opened. What are we seeing now? They're buying it. They're buying this fund, and not only are they buying it, they bought it every day for the last 5 sessions when all that panic was setting in. Look at the volume that came into this fund. The highest volume all year came in the day before a change of balance in power. They're buying this fund with both hands at a panic bottom, just like they were selling this fund with both hands at a euphoria top. That was distribution. This is accumulation. But as this goes lower and lower, real money is coming in and buying it. We're going, just like up here, strong hands were selling to weak hands. Down here, weak hands are selling to strong hands. What about Goldman Sachs? The volume in Goldman, the trading volume looks like they're selling it, but balance of power says they're buying it. What about Bear? They're buying Bear Stearns, and they're buying it with both hands. Lehman Brothers, same damn thing. History always repeats. Markets never change because people never change. Money passes from strong hands to weak hands, and then weak hands sell it back to strong hands at better prices.
Same way. Well, look at the next page. The very next page has the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate, which shows a 20% increase in the U.S. dollar nominal exchange rate at exactly the same time that you were handing out $500 billion to foreigners. Do you think that's a coincidence?
Yes.